The table went quiet in that particular way family tables go quiet when everyone recognizes cruelty, but nobody wants to be the one who names it out loud. Linda murmured her husband's name softly. Gary. A plea she'd been making in some form for 30 years, always with the same result. Gary waving a hand dismissively, already moving on, this time pivoting smoothly into a lengthy account of the six-figure year-end bonus Mitch's dealerships had just posted, a number he repeated twice for emphasis, as if daring anyone at the table to have earned something comparable. Ethan said nothing further. He'd learned long ago that engaging with his father in these moments was like arguing with a closed door, pointless, exhausting, and guaranteed to leave him feeling smaller than he had before he tried. He finished his pie in near silence, helped his mother clear the dishes afterward the way he always did, accepting her quiet, apologetic squeeze of his shoulder in the kitchen as the only acknowledgement anyone in that house was likely to offer him that night. He left before the dessert wine turned into the second round of Gary's lectures, the way he always did, driving home through empty suburban streets with his father's laughter still echoing faintly in his ears. He didn't mention, because there was no way to say it at that table without sounding either delusional or petty in exactly the way he'd spent his whole life trying not to become, that the contract he'd referenced so briefly wasn't just any contract at all. It was the final signed term sheet for a full acquisition of his company's core technology by one of the 3 largest cloud infrastructure firms in the world, a deal 18 months in careful, guarded negotiation, one that his lawyers had assured him would close and fund before the year was out, currently sitting in the final stages of a wire transfer that would arrive, quietly and without ceremony, sometime in the last week of December. The days between Christmas and New Year's had always felt strange to Ethan, suspended in a kind of calendar limbo where nothing quite counted yet, and this year that feeling was amplified by the particular tension of waiting for a number he still couldn't quite let himself believe in. He spent December 26th and 27th mostly alone in his apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a converted mill building that he'd chosen years ago specifically because the exposed brick reminded him of the garage where he and his co-founders, Billionaire and Marcus Delgado, had first started building what would eventually become Sentry Vale Security. He kept his phone close, checking it compulsively, half expecting some catastrophic email from his lawyers explaining that the deal had fallen through at the 11th hour, the way these things sometimes did in the stories he'd heard from other founders. Marcus called on the 28th, his voice tight with the same anxious energy Ethan had been carrying for days. Legal says everything's clean. Regulatory clearance came through this morning. We're just waiting on the actual wire now. How long does that usually take? Could be today, could be the 30th. These things move slow right until they move fast. Ethan spent the 29th unable to focus on anything, cleaning his already clean apartment, reorganizing a bookshelf that didn't need reorganizing, eating leftover Christmas pie directly out of the container because cooking felt like too much effort for a brain that was elsewhere entirely. He thought, more than once, about calling his mother, just to hear a familiar voice, but stopped himself each time, unsure how to explain the tangle of anticipation and dread without revealing more than he was ready to. The call came on December 30th, a Tuesday, at 11:42 in the morning. Ethan was sitting on his couch, fork halfway to his mouth, when his phone buzzed with Priya's name on the screen. Priya Chandrasekaran had been his accountant for 3 years, ever since Sentry Vale started generating enough revenue to need someone more sophisticated than the tax software Ethan had cobbled together in year 1, and her voice, when he picked up, had a barely contained excitement that made him set the fork down immediately. "It's done," she said, and Ethan could hear her hands moving across a keyboard on the other end, pulling up numbers even as she spoke. "It cleared this morning. All of it, Ethan. The wire's confirmed. It's sitting in the escrow disbursement account right now, and it's already being distributed." "Say the number," Ethan said, his voice coming out smaller than he intended. "The total acquisition closed at $1.1 billion, Priya said, and Ethan heard her take a breath before continuing. "After the venture investors take their preferred returns, after Marcus and Preeti's shares, after the employee option pool gets paid out, your personal stake comes to just over $412 million. It's yours. It's in your accounts. I'm looking at it right now." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. He sat very still on his couch, the pie container balanced on his knee, and found that his brain simply refused to process the number as something real, treating it instead the way it might treat a large astronomical distance, technically comprehensible but not something a person could actually feel in their body. $412 million. He thought, absurdly, of his father's voice from 5 days earlier. Enough to buy your own Christmas gift this year, or are you still living off ramen noodles and hope? And felt something between a laugh and a sob catch in his throat. Ethan? You still there? Yeah, he managed. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Priya. Really? Thank you. He hung up and sat in his apartment for a long time afterward, not moving, not calling anyone, simply letting the fact of it settle slowly into his understanding the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water. He didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. He felt, more than anything, a strange and profound exhaustion, as though 18 months of carefully contained tension had finally been given permission to release all at once, leaving him hollowed out and quiet in its wake. He didn't tell anyone that day. Partly it was superstition, some old instinct telling him not to speak the number aloud too soon, as if saying it might undo it. But mostly, it was simply that the number felt too enormous to say to another human being without it sounding like some kind of elaborate joke, a punchline to a story nobody would believe. He told Danielle first, 2 days later, on New Year's Day, calling her instead of texting because some things needed to be said in a voice rather than typed. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful and slightly distracted, clearly in the middle of some family activity at her own house. Hey, everything okay? Yeah. Actually, can you sit down for a second? That's an ominous way to start a phone call, Ethan. It's not bad. I promise it's not bad. He took a breath. Remember the contract I mentioned at Christmas? The one Dad joked about. Vaguely why. It wasn't a contract. It was an acquisition. The company got bought out. Fully bought out by one of the big cloud infrastructure firms. Okay, Danielle said slowly, the careful tone of a lawyer waiting for the actual point. That's great, Ethan, genuinely. How much? 1.1 billion. My share came out to just over 400 million. There was a silence on the other end of the line so complete that Ethan actually pulled the phone away from his ear to check the call hadn't dropped. When Danielle finally spoke again, her voice had gone strangely faint. Say that number again. He said it again. She was quiet for a few more seconds, and then, in a voice that cracked slightly at the edges, she said, Ethan. Oh my God, Ethan. And then, after another pause, something that made him laugh for the first time in days. Please tell me you're not still living in that mill-building apartment with the weird water pressure. He hadn't planned to tell anyone else so soon, hadn't yet decided how or when he wanted to tell his parents, some part of him still turning over the question of whether he wanted to tell them at all in any deliberate way, or simply let them find out on their own eventually and see what they did with it. That decision was taken out of his hands entirely by January 3rd. A tech industry newsletter called Circuit Brief broke the acquisition story that morning, running a piece under the headline, Under-the-radar cybersecurity startup quietly sold for $1.1 billion, that named Sentryvale Security and its 3 co-founders explicitly, including Ethan, describing the company's threat detection technology in admiring detail and noting, with the kind of breathless enthusiasm tech journalism reserved for stories like this, that the deal had closed with almost no public visibility during the negotiation process. Within hours, larger financial outlets had picked up the story, and by early afternoon Ethan's name was appearing in headlines he never could have imagined seeing about himself. Danielle, despite having been asked to keep the news quiet until Ethan figured out how he wanted to handle it, lasted approximately 6 hours before the sheer scale of the secret proved too much to sit on alone. She told Mitch first, swearing him to the same secrecy she herself had already broken, and Mitch, perhaps predictably, given the family's long history of information traveling exactly where it wasn't supposed to, mentioned it to Gary that same evening, framing it, in his own retelling, as something he'd assumed Gary already knew. Gary called Ethan that night. Ethan was in the middle of trying and mostly failing to process the surreal experience of seeing his own name in a Bloomberg headline when his phone rang with his father's contact photo, an old picture from some family barbecue years earlier, lighting up the screen. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered instead. Is it true? Gary asked, no greeting, no preamble, his voice doing something Ethan had genuinely never heard it do in 31 years. Hesitating. Is what true? Don't do that, Ethan. You know exactly what I'm asking. Ethan sat with the question for a long moment, the phone warm against his ear, thinking about the pie he'd eaten alone at that Christmas table less than 2 weeks earlier, about 30 years of comparisons dressed up as tough love, about a closed door he'd stopped bothering to knock on a long time ago. Yeah, he said finally quietly. It's true. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Ethan actually glanced at his screen to confirm the call was still connected. When Gary spoke again, his voice had lost the certainty that had defined nearly every conversation Ethan could remember having with him, replaced by something smaller, more careful, almost unrecognizable. I didn't know, Gary said. You never said anything. At Christmas, you never said a word. You never asked, Ethan said, and he kept his voice level, not cruel, simply honest in a way he'd never quite managed to be at that dinner table under the weight of 30 years of practiced silence. Not really. You asked so you could make a joke out of whatever I said back. Gary didn't have an answer for that. Ethan let the quiet sit between them for a few more seconds, unwilling this time to fill it the way he usually did, the way he'd been filling uncomfortable silences with his father his entire life. Finally, he added, I'm not upset about the money stuff, Dad. I'm upset that it took a number that big for you to stop laughing long enough to ask me a real question. There was a long pause, and then, in a voice Ethan would turn over in his memory for months afterward trying to decide if it was genuine, Gary said, You're right. I'm sorry, Ethan. I don't really know what else to say. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Ethan didn't cry, didn't forgive 30 years of small cruelties in a single phone call, didn't suddenly feel the warm, uncomplicated love for his father that he'd quietly wanted as a kid and eventually stopped expecting. But something shifted in that conversation nonetheless. Some old pattern interrupted for the first time Ethan could remember, and he found, when he finally hung up, that he felt lighter than he had in longer than he could say, not because of the money, but because he'd finally said the true thing out loud, in his own voice, to the one person who'd spent 3 decades making sure he never quite got the chance.